So the questions presented in the chat will only be seen by Alex and Karen, correct? Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Monique Braxton, the spokesperson for the School District of Philadelphia, and I'll be serving as your MC this evening. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us to discuss the district's management of environmental concerns, health and safety information, and to hear more about our path moving forward. Before we begin, let's go over some of the logistics for tonight's virtual gathering. First, we're going to hear from Superintendent Dr. Tony Watlington. Then we'll hear from Chief Operating Officer Oz Hill. After that, we're going to turn to two very special guests. Monica Harmon, a public health nurse, educator, and researcher at Drexel University. She's also Executive Director of the Community Wellness Hub. Next will be Ruth McDermott-Levy, Co-Director of the Mid-Atlantic Center for Children's Health and the Environment. She's based at Villanova. After those presentations, we're going to take some questions, Q&A of sorts, that have been previously submitted. Then we're going to give you an opportunity to hear some of the answers to your questions submitted via chat. Let's now begin our meeting. Our first person speaking tonight will be none other than our fearless leader, Dr. Tony B. Watlington, Sr.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you so much, Deputy Chief Braxton. We're so glad you joined the school district as our district spokesperson, and thanks for being here this evening. Good afternoon to all of you. We know that the shutdown of several schools relative to asbestos damage has been very concerning to many of you, and that's why we're here today. We've said it many times, and we absolutely mean it. The safety and well-being of our students and our staff members are our top priority. This is one of the reasons that we are proposing some budgetary expenditures this year to better address the historic underfunding of our school district. As you know, the average age of our school buildings is 73 years old. And the budget that we are proposing this year with the Board of Education to the City Council, we are requesting to have funding to add an executive director in our operations area to help with the management of the issues that we are addressing across the district. And we intend to invest in a much improved data management system. I do want to say that we're very thankful for the help of individuals and organizations, including the University of Pennsylvania, that committed $100 million over 10 years to address environmental concerns. I want you to know that we are also using $325 million in federal stimulus funding over 4 years for major facilities projects and innovations. We are dedicated to growing these partnerships and requesting the funding necessary to address many of these issues. Tonight, we're going to do our very best to answer many of the questions that you have, and I'm so pleased that we're joined by some health experts that will be here to support us. We will do our very best to answer all of your questions, but please know there may be some questions that we simply are not knowledgeable about. And it's one of the reasons why we've invited some health professionals to join us this evening. I want to give them as much time as possible tonight. Before I say a few more words about that, I do want to remind us that in 2017, the district commissioned a study with the Parsons Group And it found that in order to upgrade all of our school facilities to an appropriate level to address environmental hazards, to make sure that our schools are 21st century learning environments, the cost was tagged at $7.89 billion. Now, in this incremental budget that we're proposing this year, we won't get all of that, but we're certainly going to make our way to begin eating this elephant one bite at a time. A little bit later, we're hopeful that our Chief Operating Officer, Onis Hill, will join us. I don't think I see him on yet. I think he's had difficulty logging in. So I do want to share a bit more about what's going on across the district. There are nearly 300 buildings that were constructed or repaired when asbestos was commonly used in floor tiles, pipe insulation, paint, plaster, and other products. There is no simple fix to get rid of asbestos. In fact, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, says that it's often better to manage it in place and maintain it in good condition instead of removing it if it's undisturbed. So what do we mean by manage asbestos in place? Federal law requires that the district conduct thorough inspections of 295 of our buildings every 3 years to look for asbestos damage, with checkups or surveillance inspections every 6 months. We are doing that in earnest. You see buildings change over time as a result of age, weather, from construction, even from someone accidentally crashing into a wall and damaging the plaster. So these inspections are important because we want to find any damaged material and make a plan to repair them if needed to keep asbestos fibers from becoming airborne. That's when they become a health concern. Inspections can take up to 2 weeks in major buildings like high schools, with up to 3,000 areas to be inspected. In the past, due to understaffing and resources, quite frankly, the district has struggled to keep pace with the inspections and the massive volume of related data and records. But since the 2019-2020 school year, the district has brought more intention and resources to assessing and improving its environmental compliance program with a particular focus on asbestos and lead. We have brought on DeLuca Consulting Services and Tetra Tech, and they have been instrumental in helping the district to ramp up our efforts and our inspections. With them, we are conducting our inspections on a better schedule, and we are doing them more rigorously, looking in places that had been inconsistently inspected in the past, including above ceiling tiles. So you see the combination of greater resources, inspections at a better place, and looking in harder to reach places has caused us recently to find a lot more areas that need to be addressed. Additionally, and thanks to the work that has been done in recent weeks at Building 21, which we're very pleased with those students returning to their school campuses tomorrow morning, our teams have discovered inaccuracy in historical records. A plaster survey done in the 1990s, however, there are concerns that it does not consistently contain the level of accuracy the district believes necessary to manage this type of building material. So to better understand the historical data, we are reviewing the historical sampling records of our buildings with plaster and conducting additional tests on samples to confirm whether the plaster does indeed contain asbestos. So while this may sound like bad news, since about 90 of our buildings were made with concrete block, it's actually signs of a system that is improving and aggressively working to seek out areas of concern and address them so that we can maintain safe and healthy learning and work environments. So where are we as a school district? To date, the district has completed 263 three-year inspections. We expect this cycle to be completed. We are hopeful that this cycle will be completed by the end of August and start right back up again. And once completed, we will have more comprehensive records of our buildings' asbestos conditions from which to be able to monitor changes over time. And the cycle of inspections will begin anew. So we won't just do this one time, one hit, and we're done. In the meantime, we have also dedicated a team to identifying and preparing potential swing spaces. Swing spaces are spaces that we intend to use if we find asbestos problems in a school, we need to close it, part of the school or the entire school. The swing space will be the areas that we'd like to get our children into for in-person learning so that we can limit virtual learning as much as possible. This is important work and we are absolutely dedicated to it. We appreciate all of your patience and understanding. I'm going to turn it back over to Ms. Braxton now so that she can introduce our special guest who will be able to provide more specific, detailed information relative to your questions. Thank you again for being here this evening.
Thank you, Dr. Watlington, for giving us that overview. We are very fortunate tonight to have two esteemed healthcare professionals who have dedicated their lives to this work. Monica Harmon, public health nurse, educator, and researcher at Drexel University. She's also executive director of the Community Wellness Hub. And Ruth McDermott-Levy is a nurse who has a PhD, and she's co-director of the Mid-Atlantic Center for Children's Health and the Environment based at Villanova University. Thank you both for joining us this evening. Monica, you can begin.
Right. And thank you so much for this opportunity to speak with you. While Ms. Braxton read some of my professional background, what she didn't say is that I am a proud alum of the School District of Philadelphia, K through 12, and also that when I was in the 8th grade in 1990, my school was also closed because of asbestos and for a remediation. And so I just want to be that picture, if you will, of what, no ill effects afterward. I thought it was just a day off as a school student, but what I realized is that the district at the time made the best decision by closing the school for 2 weeks, covering up the asbestos, and then we were able to continue our school year. So I have slides. I hope they're coming up. But meanwhile, oh, there we go, good. So we're from representing Machi. Next slide, please. And just a little bit about the Pediatric Environmental Health Specialty Unit. Is a network of experts in prevention, diagnosis, management, treatment of health issues that arise from environmental exposures through basically before birth and through adolescence. We educate, we consult, we outreach, refer health professionals, we work with communities, schools, and we do this so that we can effectively address the challenges that face children and families by making sure we increase the capacity of the healthcare system to prevent, identify, treat, and reduce environmental exposure hazards. Next slide. And then we just also want to make sure that we improve reproductive and children's health by leading the integration of environmental health into clinical care and public health. And so what we really want to see is that we have healthy environments for all children through this work. Next slide. We are in Region 3 in Machi. The Mid-Atlantic Center for Children's Health and the Environment is housed at the Villanova University College of Nursing. Next slide. So let's get to it. So what is asbestos? So asbestos is actually naturally occurring. It is a mineral that is found in the underground in rocks and soil. So you can see some of what asbestos looks like in nature. This on my left on the screen. But basically it is a group of 6 minerals, which we're going to talk about, which is the reason why we're here, is the white asbestos or chrysotile, which is the most common. And what was found is that because this fiber was resistant to heat, high temperatures, and also it had strength, that it has been widely used in building materials and other commercial products because it insulates well and it also retards or prevents fires. And so the problem is, however, because this is occurring naturally, is that once asbestos becomes old and brittle, it starts to release tiny fibers. And what happens is when we breathe in these tiny fibers that are in the air, it enters our lungs when we inhale. So next slide. And so asbestos is not new to us. In fact, it's been mined for over 4,500 years. At first, it was used for pottery because asbestos is able to withstand high temperatures. And so the pottery used in pottery is to make sure that it seals the materials. And then around the 19th century manufacturing, we found that asbestos was used for fabrics and also for book covers, and it lasted long. And then because of this knowledge and because we had more manufacturing, then there was more mining of asbestos in nature. And then what happened was there was mass production as asbestos cement panels and pipes for building materials, water and waste lines. And then the car was mass produced as well. And then we found that in the US, for example, 43% of asbestos was mined for this use. And so up until World War II, there was also asbestos used for wartime manufacturing. So asbestos is found both commercially and in industry. Occupations such as construction workers, firefighters, automobile mechanics, these are the occupations that have the greatest risk of exposure. And we also see the greatest risk of exposure around old buildings and equipment. And asbestos, as we know, lasts, so it is in our rocks, our soil, and our water. But again, the problem is when asbestos breaks or erodes. And that's when it finds its way into our soil and other bodies of water. Next slide. Here's just a list of some common asbestos products. I won't read them to you, but you can see paper and paper products, cement, brake pads, insulation, textured paints, wood burning stoves. So still all very commonly used items that we see today. Next slide. So let's get to schools, right? So there is a federal regulation for monitoring and removing asbestos in schools. And so what the federal definition says in terms of degraded asbestos, that's what we're moving, is that friable asbestos containing material means any asbestos containing material applied on ceilings, walls, structural, piping, ductwork, or any part of the building. And the issue is when this asbestos becomes dry, it becomes friable or crumbled or pulverized. And so mostly in schools, you'll see asbestos materials around insulation and other building materials, floor and ceiling tile, cement asbestos pipe, pipe wrap, fireproofing, insulation. And again, if it's undisturbed, it's intact materials, they usually do not pose a health risk. It is when it starts to crumble. Next slide. Here are just some pictures of where you may see some asbestos materials. So if you see kind of the top right for me, these are old ceiling tiles that have not been prepared. And these are not school district buildings, by the way. So these are pictures I was able to find. To the right, you can see some piping and some insulation around it. So that kind of it almost, if you kind of zoom in on it, it almost looks like it's a bandage, old bandages or casting, if you will. And then also we have some at the bottom. That's another ceiling pipe that has also been insulated. Next slide. And then I think I have a classroom. Yep. Just if you're thinking about the classroom, because you may say, okay, well, that's the hallways. If you think about, again, the ceiling tiles, wall boards, any textured paint or popcorn ceilings, and also vinyl flooring, and that could be because of the backing and the glue as well. Next slide. So for children, why this is an issue is because children breathe very quickly, right? So children will breathe in more air per their body weight. and their lungs also continue to develop into their teens, right? And so people don't realize that children's lungs grow and mature after birth. And also the airways are smaller. So the slightest amount of swelling leads to a greater proportion of airway constriction or closing off. And so exposure to air pollution during childhood could interfere with critical lung development. Children also have different metabolisms. So their metabolisms are actually much speedier than full-grown adults. And they also continue to develop their bodies throughout childhood. And children also spend more time outdoors than adults. So again, if you have these asbestos fibers in the air, children are breathing them in. That's where the exposure could come. Next slide. Oh, wait a minute. There you go. Thank you. So there's 3 ways through which the pathway of exposure are for anyone. That's inhalation, so inhaling. So that's a primary way, and that's through inhalation of air that contains the asbestos fibers. You also have ingestion or eating or drinking. So that's why it's important to wash your hands before you eat any food, because you could have some fibers on your skin. And then, of course, the third pathway of exposure is the skin. So these fibers can lodge, but again, with proper washing, and we'll talk a little bit about that, you minimize your risk. Next slide. And just a diagram of the body, just for some, this is for long-term effects of asbestos exposure. So certainly the nose and the mouth, this is how these fibers are inhaled. When eating or drinking, you can also swallow through your voice box or your larynx. And this is, again, by long-term asbestos exposure. It can affect the lung tissues, the lung membranes, and the esophagus. Next slide, please. So I know we're here to really talk about the health risk and concerns for school children. And so there's 2 factors I would like for all of us to consider as we think about the risk, and that is how much asbestos is in the air, and how much and for how long are we exposed to the asbestos. So again, how much asbestos is in the air, but also how much and how long we are exposed. Next slide. So the risk of illness is very low from brief exposure. And really, when I've been looking at some studies, I've seen somewhere around 20 years, give or take a few years, of a latency period for exposure leading to disease. The other things that could increase your child's health concerns is that if the child already has a lung or breathing condition already, if there is smoking or secondhand smoke in the environment of tobacco, or if the youth does smoke tobacco. Also, if there's, if there's also exposure, if you're working around these products. So again, if you work in the auto industry, firefighting, the building trades, and just know again that these disease symptoms may take many years to come following exposure. Next slide. Asbestos-related conditions can be difficult to identify. What will happen if the healthcare provider identifies the possibility of asbestos exposure? They will look at, of course, what are the lung conditions that someone has, but they should also do a thorough medical history. So where did you go to school? Where did you work? What environments have you been in? Your culture. Also, if you have any, and if you're found to have these conditions, they would also do some other tools that would help them. So the physical exam, they would do a chest x-ray, pulmonary function test to see how well the lungs expand. And then also would refer you to a specialist if they found an asbestos specialist, if they found that you may indeed have this diagnosis. And again, it's over time. Next slide. Some of the other effects, so if, again, long-term asbestosis is a scarring in the tissues by breathing these asbestos fibers. What happens is that oxygen and carbon dioxide do not easily pass in and out of scarred lungs. So breathing in and breathing out becomes harder to do. And again, asbestosis usually occurs with people who have very high exposures to asbestos over a long time, but years may pass before any symptoms appear. You could also have a pleural disease, which is non-cancerous lung condition, and that's just mainly the membranes around the lungs and the chest cavity. Fluid builds up, and then you're much harder to breathe. And I know I had to put in about lung cancer and mesothelioma, again, long-term effects of asbestos and high concentration of it as well. So I just wanted to put these here. Next slide. So what does the research say, right? In our academic world, we always want to know what does the literature say. We will always tell our students to do literature review. So we found 2 articles, and there were a few others, but just some that I looked at selecting was a study of children that were less than 15 years of age and adults' first exposure to asbestos. And what they found is that the adults had the greater risk of mesothelioma than children. And then also, I found other studies that young adults, the average age of 25, who were children who lived near an asbestos mine, so that's always having these fibers around because you're manipulating the earth, they had a cumulative asbestos exposure reported respiratory symptoms. So they had the chest pain, they had the regular cough, the shortness of breath, wheezing or whistling in the chest. So again, the research says long-term high exposure to asbestos is what the danger is. Next slide. So recommendations, because I know we're all concerned about asbestos exposure. If you're concerned, of course, see your healthcare provider, and that healthcare provider will determine if you need additional testing, and that's based on the details of your exposure, the medical history, and a physical exam. After exposure, we want to think about some preventative care guidelines. So having the regular medical exams, making sure we get our vaccinations regularly against the flu and pneumococcal pneumonia, quitting smoking or not starting smoking, and this includes vaping as well, and other things that people smoke. Also avoiding further asbestos exposure. So maybe some parents, some caregivers here that work in industries where you have exposures to asbestos. So again, the construction workers, shipyard workers, brake repairs, custodians. The recommendation is that those persons thoroughly shower when they come home and change clothing and shoes before getting in the car and coming home, because you can track the fibers home. Also, if you are remodeling your home, we know that our area, we are an old city, so you will have to check if asbestos is in your home and have it contained by a certified asbestos contractor. And then also making sure that all EPA and state regulations are followed. You know, the best thing is to cover up the asbestos. Next slide. Here are just some resources for parents as well. I'm assuming the slide deck will be available. And we also do have a resource page. Next slide. And so just at this point, we just thank you. Again, we're helping you to navigate this maze. It is a lot to take in, but it's for the benefit of all of us to have a healthy and safe environment. So thank you.
We will now open it up for questions and answers. Thank you again to Monica for that informative presentation. And to our school communities that are here with us this evening, we understand the frustration and we understand the importance of transparency and really being engaging and keeping our school communities close during this period. When children are transitioned back away from the classroom and back to virtual learning, we know that's not only a strain for the school, but it's a strain for families. So we do want to take the time tonight to answer as many questions as we can. Due to the limited amount of time that we have, we will not be able to get to all of them. However, we are committed to ensuring that each question gets a written response. I also want to flag for you that there are multiple school communities on this call, so we might not be able to specifically address every question related to asbestos in your specific school. However, what we can do is, I know our COO has met with some school communities just based on the timeline of when schools were shifted to virtual learning first. And he's met with the school staff and the school communities, and he is committed to meeting with each of the school communities and the school staff directly to speak about those school-specific issues. So now we're going to open it up to the question and answer period, and Monique will then read questions that will either be directed towards our Chief Operating Officer or Monica and Ruth as our healthcare professionals.
And Ms. Braxton, may I just take a moment to officially introduce our Chief Operations Officer. He's a former military colonel, Chief Operations Officer Oz Hill. He was one of the people who had difficulty logging on earlier, so I would like to just be able to introduce him, if I may, Ms. Braxton, and just
Sure.
have him say hello very quickly, so you can know who he is. Chief Hill.
Good evening to everyone on the call. Thank you so much for your partnership, your collaboration, and your understanding and patience as we go through this process. It's a privilege to serve you.
We have some questions that have been pre-submitted. And our Chief Operating Officer, Oz Hill, who, in my opinion, is undertaking a Herculean task of overseeing certified contractors qualified to repair asbestos 24/7 to get the repairs completed as expediently and safely as possible. The first question submitted: what is the district doing to determine what schools have asbestos plaster? And are all schools being tested? Who has the oversight of that process? Chief Hill?
Thank you very much for the question, Monique. Yes, we have a process. First, let me explain that in the early 1990s, the district set out to survey all of its buildings with plaster to determine which buildings contained asbestos. Surveying is part of the process of managing asbestos in place. It's important to understand that when plaster was used in construction, it was mixed on site, and the plaster composition could be very inconsistent, much like adding a dropper to a food coloring to white frosting. If you sample in one spot, you might still get a tint of white frosting. Sample in another spot, and you may get a deep, robust color. And so it was for the plasters. Samples were taken, but not enough to meet the district's current sampling standards. And so some of the results show buildings that were believed to not have asbestos-containing plaster, but in fact, we've discovered that they do. We discovered this thanks to the work at Building 21, and our team is now conducting a review of the historic sampling for 195 buildings made with plaster to determine if our records are accurate and include enough samples to meet the district's current standards. And if not, we're doing more sampling. The district is having the current bulk sampling performed by outside contractors licensed by the city of Philadelphia to perform this work. These results are being reviewed by management planners. The district's outside consultant, DeLuca Advisory Associates, is also providing guidance while this review is being performed. So far, we've taken plaster samples at 143 buildings and are working to review this data thoroughly. When we find a school with a change in its plaster status, that means we will go back into the buildings, and in some cases, we've already done this, to inspect areas of plaster for any damage. This has led to the closure of some of our school buildings, such as C.W. Henry, Building 21, and Mitchell, as well as charter schools such as Bear. However, not all schools that have had a change in plaster status have had the extensive plaster damage which requires school closure. Monique, is that a good answer for the question?
You're the expert, Oz, so thank you. We appreciate it. I do have another question that we'd like to pose that was pre-submitted prior to tonight's meeting. Why can't the areas of damage be cordoned off so schools can proceed in other areas in the buildings where the students are comfortable? And something else along those lines, what actually happens inside the buildings when they're closed off?
That's another great question, Monique. The district is working hard to create isolated areas within buildings so that, to the extent possible, abatement work can occur while the building is unoccupied, but students and staff can remain in the building during the day. However, when asbestos damage requires the closure of a significant portion of the building, there may not be enough classroom space for students to relocate within the building. The closure of common areas such as hallways or cafeterias may also require the closure of the building, even if there is enough classroom space. When we're working in a building, we're doing what is called abatement or remediation. That is the process of encapsulating, enclosing, repairing, or removing material that contains asbestos. To reopen a space previously closed for abatement, the district or its contractors have either removed, encapsulated, enclosed, or repaired the asbestos-containing material. They've also cleaned the area where the damage and/or debris was located, and they've had a licensed asbestos project inspector take air samples and have had the air samples come back showing they met the local and federal requirements to reopen the space.
Thank you, Chief Hill. We know a lot of you have questions about exposure because the information tonight has definitely been frightening and a little frustrating. So let's turn to some of the exposure related questions and bring in Ruth now to answer some of those questions. The first one, my 6th grader has had over 10,000 hours in the school building so far. Does that constitute prolonged exposure?
That's a tough one because I didn't follow the 6th grader, so I don't know for sure. But and I'm not in the building, but from what I've heard, the child moves about the school, and so they're going to be in different places. Number one, and number two, looking at the research of what Monica shared, the risk is low for children, from what we know. And it comes from places where it is high intensity exposure. I know it sounds as though there's a lot of asbestos in the school, but it is not raining down of asbestos like the places where they're doing asbestos mining. But what I would recommend to the parents of the 6th grader and all of the parents is do talk to your healthcare provider about this, and then work on other things to address your children's respiratory health. Avoid smoking. Talk to your children about not starting smoking. Don't be smoking at home. All of those other things that add to risk, because what the research tells us is the risk is very low.
Let me follow up with that, Ruth, with another question. Is there such a thing as having a current test for students, teachers, and staff?
I know, you know what, I'm a mother too, and I would want to rush out and get a test right away and do whatever I could. The thing with asbestos is there is no test for it right now, and you know, you may want to say, well, let's do a chest X-ray, but that's just exposing your child to unnecessary radiation, and so why would you do that? So again, talk to your provider, and they can guide you, especially looking at, you know, your own child's health and what they need to do. But typically they monitor people and look at what's kind of how they're presenting with symptoms, what kind of symptoms that they have. But please do talk to your health provider, so that way they have a record and can track your child.
We see that a lot of you have your hands up. Please do submit your questions in the chat, and I'll try to get to them as quickly as I can. We have another question for Chief Hill now, and that is, what goes into making the decision to close or consider the situation an emergency? Chief Hill?
The decision to close a school or a facility is driven largely by the scope of work. A minor incident of fiber release or asbestos fiber release can generally be taken care of immediately upon discovery, and that will not warrant a school or facility being closed. A major event in terms of the scope of work and excessive square footage of space would require a school to be closed so that the work can be accomplished in the most expedient manner possible, and at the same time not expose any of the faculty or students to any hazard.
Could the work be done over the summertime?
The work, depending on scope, the size of the remediation or abatement could be integrated into our summer work stream. And in some instances, that's what has been projected. As you are fully aware, we have our summer programming and our extended school year programming that takes course over the summer months. And so access to facilities are limited in some instances because of the summer work, maintenance work orders that are being performed in those facilities that are being occupied. So these facilities or schools that are not being occupied for extended school year or summer programming, those are priority facilities for our summer work stream in terms of maintenance work orders that have been deferred. In addition to that, we would include the environmental work orders into that summer work stream. And so the scope of the project, determining what can be accomplished in conjunction with our routine summer work stream would determine whether or not a project could be completed in that time frame.
Thank you, Chief Hill. I have one more question for you, then we're going to take some more questions that are being submitted in the chat. Is the district developing relocation plans for the future as the students want to and the teachers want to continue effectively learning in the environment that they're comfortable in?
Absolutely. We are developing an overarching comprehensive strategy for relocating student communities or school communities into what we call swing spaces to allow for the most effective methodology of learning, which is in-person learning for our students. The challenge is that we don't have matching facilities and schools that are sitting vacant, waiting to be occupied. And so our strategy right now is to comprehensively look at district-owned buildings as well as commercial properties and other properties that the district does not own to identify prospective swing spaces throughout the city of Philadelphia. The one thing that I would share also is that even though there may be a space in close proximity to a school facility that is not available as a result of the environmental condition, that facility, district-owned or otherwise, has to be inspected and evaluated to determine that it is suitable for occupancy. Said another way, there may be a parochial school that is not owned by the district that is vacant, and it would have the capacity based on square footage to accommodate the school community being relocated. However, before we can take the school community that is being relocated and put them into that vacant facility, we must go in and ensure that when it was built, that the environmental conditions were suitable for occupancy at this time. So there is an evaluation process with subject matter experts from a cross section of disciplines throughout the district to ensure that any space that we relocate school communities into as a result of the environmental issues are suitable for occupancy.
And some people have asked about the swing spaces, identifying churches or other public buildings that we can partner with to be prepared ahead of time. What does that process look like at this point?
That is the process that I just alluded to. Right now, we have identified in excess of 20 prospective locations. However, we have not been able to gain access to the non-district owned facilities to evaluate and assess their suitability for occupancy. Again, what is done, the process is that a team or a committee that forms a site survey team consisting of district subject matter experts as well as representatives from the school team that is being relocated. They go in with a criteria, everything from parking to adequate classroom space to meal preparation and distribution space, cafeteria. We look at climate issues and a host of other criteria to determine whether a space is suitable. Not to mention, we're also looking at the environmental issue of that facility. One of the things that the superintendent consistently says to us and is at the forefront of our thinking is that going forward, it's nothing for you without you. So as we go through the process of identifying prospective swing spaces, we ensure that the school community is represented and part of the process of identifying suitable spaces.
We probably only have time for one more answer, Oz, and this is something that we've seen a lot of because so many people are frustrated and frightened as well. But, you know, we have something that we need to reassure folks about, and that is how the contractors repairing the asbestos are chosen.
Chief Hill and Ms. Braxton, since we were a little bit delayed getting on, could we extend another 10 minutes and at least go to 7:10 so we get the benefit of the full hour? I think that way,
No, but your chat is disabled.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Yes, the chat is disabled, the one that we've been asked to ask questions in.
We're unable to ask any questions.
So we're writing down. So you know,
Excuse me, Monique. No. Just a flag. Please direct your questions to the Q&A. So right now we've read, all the questions that we're reading are in the Q&A, not the chat, the Q&A section. So if you hit your more button and go to Q&A, Then you're able to direct your questions there. And the reason that we're doing it in the Q&A is because if we allow everyone an opportunity to speak, we won't be able to get to as many questions as possible. So we're trying to look at questions that are liked and grouped together. We're trying to ask them in multiple ways, which is why Monique is following up. So if you hit the more button, you see the Q&A. Right now, there are 40 something questions in the Q&A box. So people are getting their questions answered. Just type it in there, and we are committed to, if we don't answer it live tonight, providing a written response.
Duly noted.
It's also being recorded. We need to let everybody know. This is being recorded. It will be posted on our website because I'm sure you want to refer back just to make sure you have all of your questions answered. So let's have Chief Hill explain how these contractors are chosen.
The contractors who perform both the abatement or remediation work, as well as the project inspectors who verify that the work is being performed to standard, are trained, certified, and licensed by the licensure comes from the city of Philadelphia, which has a rigorous standard for licensing to perform this work. There is an RFP process for the abatement contractors, as well as the companies that provide the inspectors. The inspectors cannot come from the companies or firms selected to provide the abatement work. So there is rigor and there is integrity in the process to ensure that the work is being performed to standard. And the district also provides oversight with its Office of Environmental Management Services subject matter experts who provide overall programmatic management of these processes and procedures for these trained, certified, and licensed environmental experts.
What if this happens? You know, you have human error involved. What if something is missed during the 3-year inspections? Do the buildings, you know, are they sitting and waiting for another 3 years for inspectors to come through?
No, ma'am. We have the 3-year inspection process or requirement. It's a federal mandate. And then we have the 6-month inspection process. It's a constant cyclical process of continuously going into these buildings, looking and inspecting. In addition to that, each of our school facilities has what is known as a site-specific maintenance or management plan. And in that document, which is maintained by both the principal of the school as well as the licensed building engineer, there is a daily process or requirement for a walkthrough inspection and observation of any materials that appear to be damaged. In addition to that, on a monthly basis, the principal is required to do a walkthrough with the building engineer to identify maintenance requirements that should be submitted via our work order system. And on a quarterly basis, the facility area manager, who has oversight of the building engineer, is required to meet with the principal to ensure all of the maintenance issues are addressed. Those that have been identified, again, to include any issues that could be environmental in nature.
Someone has also asked us about the level of exposure, and that seems to be the main category for all of the questions. So if you have a pinhole exposure, say in a pipe or a pipe lining, How do you know that level of exposure? And how do you know whether it's an emergency? One parent has stated, we were told it was not an emergency, but out of an abundance of caution, the school was shut down. So if you could tell us what you know about the level of exposure and then what's being done under cautionary measures.
Well, first and foremost, the well-being and safety of students and faculty is the number one priority in all of this environmental work that we're doing. And if there is any incident that cannot be determined to be a non-hazard or not hazardous to the school community, out of an abundance of caution, we're going to assume that there is a reason to either isolate or, if necessary, to close the space off to ensure that there is no exposure of a hazard to the school community. Again, and I can't overstate this, the mechanism is that the safety and well-being of the school community is the number one priority. And if we cannot be certain, we are always going to err on the side of caution to ensure that there is no exposure as best we can to the school community upon becoming aware. That stated, a minor and major incident is determined by the size or scope of the abatement. Generally speaking, any area of suspected fiber release incident that is less than 3 square feet is remediated on the spot, and it is done by our asbestos abatement team out of OEMS. If it exceeds that, then that is performed by contractors who have, based on staffing, have the greater capacity to perform a larger scale abatement. I cannot, again, speculate on the level of exposure regarding any a pinhole or anything larger. That exceeds my capability to do that. What I can tell you is that if there's any suspected incident of fiber release, immediately, if it can be addressed by our A team or our asbestos team, it is done immediately. And it's also worth remembering that these inspections and the work is performed when the schools are not occupied by faculty or students.
So let's talk about being, if we can say, proactive. If your child is in a classroom and they notice that there's chipping paint on plaster or in a hallway, how do they go about reporting that if they're concerned about that?
Immediately, it should be brought to the attention of the school's staff and administration. The building engineer should be made aware. The principal should be made aware. And if there's any question at all, we will deploy either our asbestos manager, who is a district employee, or we will deploy our lead-based paint stabilization manager, who also is a district employee, to immediately assess and evaluate the suspected material.
I have a question for, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. As a result of that, the appropriate action will be taken to immediately remove the students and faculty from the space that if it poses any type of hazard, or if there's any question, it will be done, as you mentioned earlier, out of an abundance of caution.
Let me give you a moment to get a glass of water, because I know a lot of questions have been coming your way. And I'll pose this question to Dr. Watlington. Would it be more cost effective in the long term to systematically tear down or rebuild older buildings?
Certainly, there are cases where that will make sense to do. In the Parsons report that was done in the district and commissioned in a study done in the district, I think completed in the district in 2017, it gave us two findings. One, the cost to upgrade all of our facilities to take care of environmental hazards and bring our facilities up to a standard that we should expect for teaching and learning in the 21st century would be $7.89 billion. Two, the Parsons report noted that there are some 20 plus schools that it would make sense to repurpose, rebuild, recreate, or do something different with. So it depends on the school, the particular school context, but in some cases, yes, that would be correct.
I know that question came up when I was out with the C.W. Henry families, so I wasn't surprised to see it again. Some parents want to know if inspection reports are public.
Yes, inspection reports, after they have been received, vetted, properly documented in our data management system, they are posted for the school community to review.
Okay. Parents and families, please continue putting your questions online so that we can continue having our health professionals as well as our chief operating officer and definitely our superintendent respond to your questions. We are going to be providing written answers to all of the school families. And we also want to remind you that there will be a link to this recording on the website in the near future, and that's philasd.org. So let me see if we have some other questions that have come in. Let's see. Let me call on Ruth to share some of her report with us, because a lot of questions are focusing on the health aspect. Ruth?
I didn't hear the beginning part to share. What did you ask me to share?
Some more of the health aspect, because a lot of the questions are focusing on exposure and the dangers, and how do you even know that asbestos is in the air in your particular school?
Okay, well, that actually, I mean, it would be up to some of the things that Monica showed of kind of, you know, aging of our plaster and flooring and those sort of things, and insulation. So that, you know, are the signs and all the inspections that were just discussed. I would like to share the Mid-Atlantic Center. We cover from down to, you know, Virginia and West Virginia to Pennsylvania. So we cover 6 states. And so we often do work with different school districts. And sometimes we have to fight to get kids out of the school. The school district will keep the kids while they are working and doing construction, which is really unsafe. And so as parents, I think you should rest assured that the Philadelphia School District is putting the kids first, and the staff and faculty, by removing them from something that's unsafe. But I can also say I appreciate how hard that is as parents of, you know, having to get your child to another school or actually having them at home, especially, you know, in this post-COVID world, because we already done that. So that's one thing. I you know, I was really thrilled to hear that. The other thing is, again, you know, we're talking about risk. And so the risk, the people that we see get very ill from asbestos exposure are people who are exposed for long periods of time that work in those industries, such as construction, such as people who work with car brakes and things. And I do understand your concern and your worry, but there's other things that you can do to keep your child healthy. And so, you know, looking at, again, I'm a big advocate of getting rid of the cigarette smoke in your home or any kind of tobacco smoke. Looking at, we've found out more about gas stoves, and they can be a problem. So if you're able to ventilate when you have, if you use a gas stove, like thinking about those kinds of things to keep you and your family healthy, really can, in the long run, be a better, like bigger bang for your buck of really the things you need to do, preventative things, and getting flu shots and all those things.
I hate to interrupt, but our kids spend way more time in schools than they do when we're cooking in the house and things like that. And it does seem like it's a huge risk, not just for asbestos, but lead, because it's in so many of these old buildings. And I guess I'm also wondering, would the school district be able to provide testing, because not everybody can readily get a doctor's appointment or anything like that?
So for lead, because lead is a problem in our aging schools as well, and in our aging homes. And so, yes, you can get tested at either with your provider or at the health centers. You can get tested for lead. And those of you who think that's a risk, absolutely get your child tested, because that's other things that we work on. And yes, they do spend a lot of time in the school, but they're not working directly with the material like they do in people that we see have the cancer-related asbestos disease.
So
So
I have
yes,
a
it's
question.
a risk, but it's not as high of a risk as you hear. I mean, asbestos, when you hear it, is really scary, but it is a risk. But it's not. We're not seeing children getting ill from this. That's very rare.
So we have another question for Chief Hill. Ruth, thank you so much. We appreciate your expertise. The question is, why isn't the policy to always remove the material instead of encapsulating the material? Chief Hill, why don't we turn this question over to you for an answer?
Yeah. If we follow the federal guidelines for the management of the material, best practices as identified by the Environmental Protection Agency indicates that the most effective way to manage this material is to keep it, control it in place, or manage it in place either through encapsulation or isolation, as opposed to removing it. The challenge with removing it is that you're going to release an overwhelming amount of fibers out into the air.
Why don't you try to unmute yourself? I just had to do the same thing.
I'm so
Okay,
sorry.
there you go. No, it wasn't.
I'm sorry. The Environmental Protection Agency has indicated that the most effective way to manage asbestos containing material is that when at all possible, it should be encapsulated or managed in place as opposed to removing it. One of the hazards associated with the mass removal of a lot of asbestos material is that you would be disturbing it. And as a result of that, the overwhelming amount of fibers released into the air potentially would present a greater hazard than managing it in place.
Are you looking to recruit people who are trained to address the environmental hazards such as asbestos and lead? And then if you could also tell us what kind of training, how long does that training take?
We are actively recruiting any licensed asbestos abatement contractors, as well as licensed asbestos project inspectors. Most recently, we have met with several of the contractors affiliated with the Construction Workers and Builders Trade Union to identify certified contractors who are available to do this work. There are certainly, and let me be very clear with this, there are certainly contractors in this region, in the tri-state region, who are trained to do this work, but they, many of them are not licensed by the city of Philadelphia to do this work. We have met with the city of Philadelphia's leadership regarding the standards, which are comprehensive, and what they have agreed to do is to provide navigation or access to comply with those standards to receive the certification necessary to perform this work for any prospective individuals that are pursuing the certification. We cannot hire asbestos removal or remediation technicians who do not have the licensure by the city of Philadelphia.
You mentioned working with the Building Trades Union.
Yes.
What about the PFT?
Yes, we have partnered, and I'm proud to say that we are partnering with the PFT to confirm that the evaluations, the sampling, and the testing that is performed is consistent, mutually consistent for reoccupation of the facility. So as it applies to Building 21, for example, we had the PFT Health and Welfare Fund environmental subject matter expert and leadership monitoring our process, and then actually performing a walkthrough to verify that the space was suitable for reoccupancy.
Thank you, Oz. Dr. Watlington, I have a specific question for you. Does the reevaluation that the plaster material that had previously been deemed safe and now declared unsafe change the number of buildings recommended for closure or replacement by the Parsons report?
The Parsons report, again, was completed in 2017. I think there may have been an update subsequent to that. We don't continue to employ the services of the Parsons Group on a contract. So we've not updated that report in 2023. So I would be unable to speak to what the Parsons Group would say now. I will say that the full details of that Parsons report, I want to be very transparent about this. I think last month we shared that report in open session with the city council. And so that information is in that presentation is publicly available on the city's meeting schedule site.
What has this been like for you, Dr. Watlington? You've been here for a year, and it's been now about 2.5 months since school after school has reported asbestos above ceiling tiles, in plaster, etc.
Well, I will just say that certainly this issue, this notion of historic underfunding in the school district of Philadelphia is very, very real. I think it's important to note that because of that historic underfunding, we've got needs that, according to 2017 dollars, equate to $7.89 billion to a B to bring our schools up to an acceptable level. Now, I've worked in 2 districts in other states, for example, where we stopped closing schools in the summer years ago due to hot weather. And so the fact that 57% of our schools don't have adequate air conditioning is a real challenge that we have to work through, particularly when other districts that are not Rockefeller rich have figured out how to address those problems years ago, such that they don't have to close schools in the summer or the warm weather months. And this issues of environmental hazards, we've got some significant issues, but I'm encouraged by the fact that we're making progress. It sounds strange to say, but the mere fact that schools have closed speak to the process working with these 3-year required federal inspections and the 6-month systems that we're following. So I do have great confidence in Chief Oz Hill, our Chief Operations Officer, and his team. I'm looking forward to adding a new executive director under his leadership to help. And we're also looking forward to investing in a much improved data management system. So we're making progress. We've got a long way to go, but we are making progress, and we'll just have to work through this and continue to do the work that we're required to do.
Thank you, Dr. Watlington. We have had over 100 questions, and we want to thank everyone again for tuning in. We've got about 5 minutes left, and we have one last question, and that is, how will everyone know, all of the school communities on the Zoom tonight, know updates on abatement, the discovery of abatement, the removal and or repairs of abatement, and the timeline for each school? I'll let Dr. Watlington and Chief Hill answer those questions, that question.
I want to say 2 things to answer that question, and then I'll kick it over to the COO Hill. Number one, we are in the process of finalizing a project team that will include people who work inside of the school district and people from outside of the school district who have expertise in this area. We want to engage our leaders in the city. We want to engage citizens in the city on this project team so we can identify the best strategies long-term, because this is a long-term issue. We did not get into this situation overnight, and I want to level set with you. We will not get out of it overnight. That's number one. Number two, we're committed to being transparent about what we find and where we are as a district. Now, in terms of how we continue to keep our parents and families updated, we've been trying to do that through our communications department in terms of how we share information with the press. We are open to looking at other ways that we continue to keep our families updated and informed, not limited to things that we are posting on the website. So we'll take these questions and feedback, and we'll continue to consider the best ways to keep our families updated as we continue to do this work. I'll ask Chief Hill if he has anything extra to add there.
Yes, sir. What I would add is that we are committed to providing periodic updates on the progress that we're making with regard to your specific schools. The scheduling of those updates will be coordinated through the principals and the school administrators in terms of the frequency and when they're going to occur. Additionally, we will develop a methodology or refine our methodology of keeping the entire community, school communities in the district informed of the results or the inspection schedule for our 3-year and 6-month inspections, and provide feedback when they've been accomplished. We recognize that in the spirit of transparency, that we need to do better in that regard, and we will.
Thank you, Chief Hill. Also, thank you, Dr. Watlington. We'd like to give an extra special thanks to our healthcare professionals who joined us this evening. Monica Harmon, public health nurse, educator, and researcher at Drexel University, and Dr. Ruth McDermott-Levy, a nurse and director of the Mid-Atlantic Center for Children's Health and the Environment over at Villanova University. We also want to let you know that we'll be providing a recording of tonight's Zoom meeting on our website, philasd.org. And more importantly, all of you who have submitted questions, know that we're going to have written answers for you. We'll be communicating the conversation with your administrators and your principals. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your evening to listen to our Zoom tonight. Have a great night.
Before we leave, I do have one more question. Are the, excuse me, are the superintendent and the COO willing to come and meet with the communities of the schools who have been shut down individually so that we can talk more intimately about the problems that are happening at our individual schools?
That has been happening, Quad Squad Mama, just letting you know, we have been doing that, and that will continue. We are scheduling meetings with all of the principals and the school communities.
In fact, to your point,
Thank you.
Braxton, I'm looking forward to being at Building 21 tomorrow morning. And as those students return to classes, and Chief Hill has been out and about. I want to commend his team, him and his team. They've been in the field even more than I have. But we absolutely want to stay connected to you. We want you to feel like you can talk to us. And we want to be there to help support any and all concerns you have to the extent that we have the right information to do so. So thank you so much.
Oz, would you like to say a few words regarding meeting with the communities again? Phil?
I look forward to every opportunity to provide accurate information regarding the environmental disposition of the schools that have been impacted. And it's a privilege and an honor to serve you. And I say that on behalf of the 3,200 employees in operations that serve you every day with bus transportation, food services, facilities maintenance, capital programs, transportation, and of course, the Office of Environmental Management Services. Thank you so much for your support and your patience as we work through this process.
We understand it's been very, very difficult, but we thank you for joining us tonight. Keep your questions coming, reach out to us, let us know any of your concerns. And if we can't answer those questions, we'll get them from an expert for you.
And Ms.
Thank you.
Braxton, I want to conclude by just saying we're very glad to have a very transparent district spokesperson in Ms. Monique Braxton. She's also very active in this community and is well versed on the issues. And there are times when we are in lots of places and have to be in lots of other places. But please know that we have a dedicated district spokesperson who is also making sure that we're being very transparent and communicative with all of our communities. So thank you, Ms. Braxton.
Thank you, Dr. Watlington. I appreciate it. Have a good night, everyone, and we'll be in touch.
And good night.
Sorry to interrupt, Ms. Braxton, just a moment. I just wanted to confirm that the questions that were not able to be answered on the line, will they be included in the written responses?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
We got to as many as we could, but know that we're going to have written responses for you.
Okay, thank you. Have a great night.
We hear you. We want you to know we hear you.
Good night.
Much appreciated.